Well, good evening. How's everybody? Is everybody warm and toasty and dry? And it kind of has that all day, that kind of that cold, wet feeling. That, but better than last Wednesday, right? When we were not able to be here and no school for 4 days last week, and so our preschool closed, and it was just a weird week, weird way to start the month. But a little bit more normal this week, and hard to believe it's February, and time just keeps racing on. Yeah, Valentine's Day is next Tuesday. Our anniversary is next Thursday. We got married on the 16th, 2 days after Valentine's Day. So it's hard for me to believe 38 years for us. So anyway, time just moves rather quickly. So in terms of tonight, I thought about coming up here and doing something by myself online last week, but I thought, the idea of the Reformation up through the Wesleyan revival and the wrestling movement, really in terms of what I could talk about that I didn't really cover in the sermons and expand on, I can handle all of that tonight. And with that, if I don't go off on too many tangents. So I want to revisit a little bit surrounding the Reformation and talk about some of the things I didn't have time to talk about a week ago Sunday, about that period of history of the Reformation that, for me personally, in terms of church history, the time from the Reformation through the Wesleyan revival, so that about 200-year period or 250-year period is the most really interesting period of church history and Christian history for me. I am such a fan of Martin Luther and of John Wesley and of the Reformers, and they have such an impact on me that I really love this time. I love Martin Luther, even though I'm a Methodist, not a Lutheran, but I love Luther's personality and how he approached things. So talking about this period of time, and I may have said this before, and I have to be careful. If I repeat myself, forgive me, but the reason that the year 1500 is so significant, or that era, the few years before and after the year 1500, is because of how much the world changed. In some ways, it's what is usually called the end of the Dark Ages, the beginning of what is often referred to as the Renaissance. It is a total change in culture, especially of Western culture. Lots and lots of things are happening in that time. Lots of new movements. Of course, the word Renaissance means new birth or rebirth. And there was a rebirth of culture, a rebirth of literature, a rebirth of art, painting, music, sculpture. I mean, it was just, there's so much happening in the world. And the thing that was the most significant thing that happened around that time was the invention of the printing press. I may have said this before, but when we hit the year 2000 and they put out I think Time Life put out a book of the 1,000 most significant events of the last 1,000 years, or the most significant things that happened between the year 1000 and the year 2000. Number one was the printing press. It changed life in ways that it's hard to even imagine how different life was before the printing press, before when every written thing had to be done by hand. The vast majority of the world was illiterate. Most people couldn't read or write. Only the clergy were the most educated people in the world up until that time, in terms of being able to read and write. The upper classes who had private tutors, who had the ability to buy manuscripts and books, could read and write. The way a Bible was produced before the printing press was literally, if you've seen probably cartoons or pictures or paintings of monks hunched over a desk with a quill, copying the Bible, making a handwritten copy of the Bible, which would take the average monk 1 year to do one copy of the Bible. So by hand, one copy a year per monk. So only very, very wealthy people could afford a Bible. Most churches had one Bible, and the only person who could read it was the priest. So it's an incredibly different world. Information, the way that information could travel is so vastly different from what we've come to expect. Of course, I've said, and you can't know what will be the significant moments of history until you're kind of past them. I think the smartphone will have, looking back, will have a similar kind of impact upon how the culture changes. If you look at culture before the smartphone, culture after the smartphone. Just thinking about before we all had iPhones, how did you look things up? How did you get information? How do we know what time the movie's going to start? Well, let's find a newspaper and look for the times, or let's call the theater and listen to the recording of what time the movies are starting. I mean, that was the world we all lived in, at least if we're old enough to live in that time. And every other bit of information, how are you going to find out who was president in, 1920? Well, do you own an encyclopedia? You might go there. Better go to the library. There's, the way that we accessed information before the internet, and then specifically before we had the internet in our pockets, is vastly different. Well, the same kind of change was the printing press. Printing press changed life. It allowed greater literacy. It allowed information to be distributed. It allowed people to own books. It just was an amazing change. It also allowed for printing the Bible. And of course, one of the things that is curious about the Catholic Church, many things curious about the Catholic Church, was how illegal it was to translate the Bible out of anything other than Latin. Now, the original languages were Greek and Hebrew, but the official Bible for centuries in the Catholic Church had been the Latin Bible. The Bible was translated into Latin several hundred years before that. It was referred to, when it was first done, that this Latin translation of the Bible was called the Vulgate, as in the word vulgar, because it was translated out of the classical languages of Greek and Hebrew into the vulgar language of Latin. Vulgar just meaning common, the common language of the Roman Empire, Latin. And so when people attempted to do a translation of the Bible, like William Tyndale in England, he was burned at the stake for it, for daring to translate the Bible into English. You think, why did the church not want the Bible translated into the common language?
So they could make their own translations of how they want it.
Well, they could tell the people what it said, instead of allowing the people. Knowledge is always power, And when you control access to information, when you can tell people this is what it says, and the people, even if they've learned to read and write in their own, in German or French or English or whatever, if they don't read Latin, because by the Middle Ages, there's lots of different languages all throughout Europe. If you don't read and speak Latin, and you probably can't read it, you would go to the Mass. The entire Mass is in Latin. The people heard the Mass in Latin. Did they understand the words of the Mass? Not really. And the Latin Mass was still done up through the middle of the 20th century. It wasn't until the Second Vatican Council, which was in the 1960s, that they actually started encouraging Catholic churches to have the Mass in the common language of the people, and not in Latin. It was just a bunch of magic words to people. The phrase hocus pocus comes from a misunderstanding of the Latin in the Catholic Mass. It's just, the priest said his magic words over the wine, and it became the blood of Jesus. And he said his magic words over the loaf of bread, and it became the body of Jesus. And people, the power was in the priest being able to tell people, this is what it means, this is what it says. And most people could not check read a Bible to know if what he was saying was true or not. Which, again, I know I said I'd try not to get off on rabbit trails, but our Muslim friends, it is illegal to translate the Quran in any other language other than Arabic. It is illegal to translate the Quran. So many Muslims have never read the Quran. They can't. They don't speak Arabic. They can't read and write Arabic. So they've never read the Quran. They only know what the imam tells them. They only know what their particular teacher or elder tells them it says. And I get frustrated sometimes because you look at all different Muslim countries, and you go to somewhere like Jordan, which is a Muslim country. The women are dressed close to what they're dressed in a Western country. You go to Afghanistan, and burqas are required. And you say, well, what's the big difference? Nowhere does the Quran order women to cover themselves head to foot. That's nowhere in the Quran. But in Afghanistan, they say that they have to do it because knowledge is power. And if people can't read and write for themselves, they can only believe what they're told. So anyway, all that to say, the printing press changes everything. The Gutenbergs and their printing press. So that sets up Luther. As I said, as most of you know, the main beef that Luther has with the Catholic Church, he has several beefs with them, but the main one is indulgences. Indulgences, and I can't really remember how much of detail I went into any of this, but the idea of purgatory, that is the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, is that the Catholics believe that, at least they were taught, and this is a doctrine of the Catholic Church that wasn't around until the 10th century. So it doesn't go back, it's 1,000 years ago, but it doesn't go back to the early church fathers or the early church. This doctrine of purgatory, as in purge, that the average Christian is not ready for heaven. They're still too tainted by sin. They're still too full of sin. So the teaching arose in the Catholic Church of purgatory, a place where once you die as a Christian, you would go to this realm of purgatory. Now, if you weren't a Christian, you would just go to hell. But if you were a Christian and you weren't pure, you would go to purgatory for, a few hundred years, where you would be purged of your impurities and your sin until you were ready for heaven. And only very holy people, saintly people, could bypass that and go straight to heaven. And this teaching of purgatory was not a pleasant place. It was a place of purging, a refinement, just like gold is refined in the fire. So it was not taught to be a pleasant experience to be in purgatory. And so you didn't want to spend a lot of time there. And so as they begin to say, how are we going to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome? Which, by the way, having been now to Israel and to Rome and to the Vatican, when the Babylonians sacked the first temple, they brought the good stuff from the temple back to Babylon, to Iraq. When the second temple was built, it was destroyed by the Romans. The Romans pulled the precious part of the second temple back to Rome. Some of those materials were actually used in the construction of the Colosseum. When St. Peter's Basilica was built, parts of the Colosseum were actually used to build St. Peter's Basilica. So you think about these materials, how they traveled from place to place like that. But they got to raise a lot of money to build this magnificent church in Rome, St. Peter's. It's going to cost an enormous amount of money, and having been inside of it one time, it is magnificent. So the idea is, how do you raise money to build St. Peter's? Well, people don't want to spend a lot of time in purgatory. How can they shorten their time? Well, by doing a good deed. And what is the best good deed you could do? Well, help the church. How can you help the church? With a monetary donation. So the idea was, you make a monetary donation to the church. That's a good deed. that good deed now allows the Pope to shorten your time in purgatory. How can the Pope do that? Because the Pope, in Catholic teaching, is the successor to Peter. Peter, as the successor to Peter, he has the keys to the kingdom. And he has access to what was called the treasury of merit. Treasury of merit. The treasury of merit, again, now this is a very much an oversimplification, but think about a saint like Mary, okay? Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's not just holy, she's like uber holy. She's super holy. So not only can she go straight to heaven, although in the 1800s they teach that Mary never died, that she was taken directly to heaven. That's called the Assumption of Mary. But Mary is the only one who never had to die. And that's because Catholics teach that Mary never died because Mary never sinned. And since the wages of sin is death, and Mary never sinned, Catholics teach that she was taken directly to heaven, the Assumption of Mary. That's from the 1800s. Anyway, but saints have all this holiness, like more than they need. And so it's almost like they have extra credit holiness that goes into the treasury of merit. And who can access the treasury of merit? The Pope. So, I'm a middle-class person in Germany in the early 1500s. I know that my parents were a little salty, you know. They got into trouble once in a while. So I think they've died. They're probably in purgatory for several hundred years. How do I get my parents out of purgatory more quickly? Well, I purchase an indulgence, and the Pope takes X number of years off my parents' time in purgatory. That's how the idea of an indulgence worked. And so the church had salesmen, basically, going all through the Catholic world, selling indulgences. And the one that particularly got on Martin Luther's nerves was a fellow named Tetzel, whose territory included where Luther was. And he even had a jingle that translated from German into English is something like, "As soon as coin in coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." So, this is a booming business of selling indulgences so that people could not only shorten their own time in purgatory, but shorten their parents' time, their grandparents' time, their great uncle so-and-so's time, etc., etc., etc. Raises enormous amounts of money for Rome. It also raises the blood pressure of Martin Luther because Luther, as I said, is a monk who is also a brilliant theologian. He speaks Greek, he speaks Hebrew, he speaks Latin, he speaks German, obviously. His superiors, seeing his great intellect, have made his job as a monk, as a priest, to be a theology professor. And as he is studying Paul's writings, specifically Romans, he sees how often Peter emphasizes that we're saved not by works, but by faith. He sees how often Paul talks about we're not saved by our works so that no man would boast, but that we are saved purely by the blood of Christ, purely by grace, purely through faith. And we can't earn our salvation or buy our salvation or deserve our salvation. We can only receive it from a loving God as a grace. So he says the whole scheme of purgatory and indulgences and the Pope and the treasury of merit, the whole thing is wrong. The whole thing is not biblical. And that's why he writes these 95 theses, 95 statements that he says, here are all of the things that our church, the Roman Catholic Church, is teaching that are not scriptural, that are counter to the plain teaching of the Bible. And the thing that he is most focused on is indulgences, although he also questions why the Pope has this kind of authority. He questions the celibacy of the priesthood, which again is not biblical because, well, Peter had a mother-in-law. If Peter had a mother-in-law, what does that tell you? Peter was married. And the Pope is supposedly the successor to Peter. On and on and on. The various things that he said. And he just said this, maybe naively, as these are things we need to debate and discuss and reform. He wasn't looking to break away from the church. He was looking for reformation. And he posts the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany on October 31, 1517. And thinks that maybe the church will take him seriously. They don't. But his friends take his writings and publish them, print them up. They're translated out of German or out of Latin into German, into other languages. They spread all over Europe because of this new invention of the printing press. And people who can read and rulers who are already chafing under the Pope's thumb are thinking, maybe Luther's right. Maybe we don't have to bow and scrape to the Pope. Maybe, this idea of not just Reformation, but a whole different way of doing church, a whole different way of thinking about church, this Protestant way of thinking about church spreads. And that is the flame of the Protestant Reformation. And as I said, Luther, of course, is told he must recant, take it all back, say you're sorry. And Luther won't. And he has to kind of go into hiding and go from place to place and keep a low profile because some of the secular princes, because Germany is not a unified country at this point. It's a whole bunch of little small things, different princes kind of fall either Protestant or Catholic, and they want all their people to go that way. And Luther's under the protection of some of these secular princes and is able to continue writing. He translates the entire Bible into German. He does a lot of other amazing things. His thoughts on the Pope, the longer they go, his thoughts on the Pope go from saying he is not really the successor to Peter to Luther goes to saying the Pope is the Antichrist. So Luther goes from... He may go even a little past the needle on that, to saying that the Pope is the Antichrist. But remember, the popes of that time were it was a totally political office. It was total politics. And this is the time when I say the Borgia family had a pope. And I mean, really, crime families had popes. It is an office that is there through bribery and all kinds of other ways. Popes are elected, twisting the arms and bribing the cardinals to elect the person that they want. Popes often had multitude of illegitimate children, even though they were supposedly celibate, etc., etc., etc. This is a terrible time of corruption in the Catholic Church. And so, this is what starts the Protestant Reformation. And of course, like most movements, it's a lot more complicated than that. Because it's not really every person can decide for themselves. It's more like the prince of this area would decide, are we a Catholic or are we Protestant? And then expect all of the people in his region to fall in line with whatever he said. So it's not really sort of the freedom of religion that we would consider. Luther is not a perfect person. The thing you'll learn about in history is none of your heroes are perfect. Luther was anti-Semitic, said some terrible things about the Jews. So Luther is by no means a perfect person by our standards. But he had a personality that, for good or ill, he was a stubborn guy who was not going to back down. And as he got more and more freedom from Rome, he married a former nun. They had a lot of children together. His writings are blunt, and that's part of what makes him fun to read. He is credited with being the first person to have a Christmas tree lit with candles. Whether that's true, maybe that one, we're not too sure about that one. He wrote the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Martin Luther is the author of that hymn. He is a Renaissance man in many, many ways. I mentioned the fact that the church offices were bought and sold. He's like, why would you buy, I want to be a bishop and I'll pay you this much to be a bishop. Because if you're a bishop, you owned land. And that, as a landowner, as a bishop who's a landowner, you make money off of that land. So people wanted to be a bishop or an archbishop or a cardinal, because with each of those church offices came money and land and prestige and power. And so there were 14-year-old bishops. People buying these offices for their sons when they were still teenagers. I mean, there was just, and there were bishops and archbishops and cardinals who had no interest in the church whatsoever. It was purely about money and land and power and prestige. So, now what I didn't have time to talk about when we're talking about the Reformation was, of course, Luther doesn't do this single-handedly. His ideas spread, and other leaders in their own countries lead similar movements. Probably the only one I'm going to talk about, the only one you may have heard of, other than Martin Luther, as a reformer and someone who is very well known from this time period, is John Calvin. I assume most people have at least heard the name John Calvin. John Calvin is French. He is trained to be a lawyer, but he, starts to have very similar thoughts to Luther and reads Luther, is involved with this whole movement of Reformation. He's younger than Luther. But again, as someone who had actually been to the ancient equivalent of law school, has a brilliant mind, becomes convinced that the Catholic Church is not teaching correct doctrine. He begins to preach this or teach this. He's not a priest. He's a lawyer. But he begins to teach this in France. France at this time is still very Catholic, and they're persecuting anyone who starts to have Protestant ideas. So Calvin has to flee to Geneva, Switzerland, and it's there that he studies Latin, he studies Greek, and Koine Greek, which is the biblical kind of Greek, and he writes extensively about Protestantism, about theology. He is a theologian. Even though he's not a clergyman, he is a theologian. And he writes a book called The Institutes of Christian Religion. The Institutes of Christian Religion. He publishes the first version of that in 1536. He keeps revising it. I mean, up until his death, he kept revising it and expanding it over and over and over again. It went from like one volume to like 50 volumes or something. He just kept writing more and more and more and more versions of this. So he too is a Protestant, leading a Protestant Reformation in France, in exile, and in Switzerland. Now, he and Luther agreed about a lot of things and had some correspondence, but they disagreed about some things as well. And the main thing they disagreed about was communion. Because when Luther split from the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church has a doctrine called transubstantiation. You heard that word? The Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist, of the Mass, of what we would call communion or Lord's Supper. The Catholic doctrine is called transubstantiation, which is a Catholic teaching that says when the priest prays over the host, as they would call it, the bread and the wine, when the priest prays over the bread and the wine, every time the priest does that, there is a miracle. And the bread becomes literally the body of Christ, and the wine becomes literally the blood of Jesus. Now, except even though it still tastes like wine and it still tastes like bread, they would say that intrinsically it has actually been transformed into the body and blood of Jesus. That's why it's called transubstantiation. The substance of it has been changed, even though again, this gets into philosophical terms. And, anytime you get into philosophical terms, you think, those guys crazy? And having a philosophy degree, yes, they are. This gets back to Plato, to be honest. It would say the substance of the bread is the body of Jesus, but the accidental qualities of the bread, like smell and taste, are still bread. That's philosophical thinking, that it may look like bread, it may taste like bread, it may smell like bread, but it's really the body of Jesus. So that's what transubstantiation is in the Catholic Church. And so therefore they say every time the priest says the Mass, there is a miracle. And that's why they refer to it as the host. The bread is now hosting the very essence of Jesus. Okay? So that's why in a Catholic church, and again, I've visited a few Catholic churches, and when we were in Europe a couple of times, went to Catholic masses because we wanted to observe things. In a Catholic church, once the bread and the wine have been transubstantiated, and it doesn't all get eaten or drunk, you can't just put it down the sink. The priest has to finish every crumb and every drop. You can't just toss it out. So I've seen a priest. They take a little thing and they scrape every crumb off the plate and eat it, and they wipe the cup. And every drop and every crumb has to be consumed once it's been transubstantiated. So that's the Catholic teaching. Luther did not believe in transubstantiation, but he wasn't willing to let go of the idea that something miraculous happened. So Luther took a kind of a position that was, it's not quite that. He called it consubstantiation, which he said, there's still something miraculous, but it's not quite what the Catholics believe. And I won't go into, again, because you get into philosophical words and differences that don't really seem different. But Luther had a different view of communion that was really still more Catholic. Calvin has a more view that would be similar to what we Methodists would believe. Communion is a time that when we come to the table, Jesus meets us there. It's a holy time. It's a sacred time. We grow closer to Christ as we receive the elements, but we don't say that anything supernatural or miraculous is happening to the actual bread or the actual juice. But this is where Luther and Calvin disagreed. So they're not quite on the same page with these things. But when you think about John Calvin, if you've ever thought about John Calvin, you may not have ever thought about John Calvin. I don't know that I ever thought about him until I went to seminary. When you think about John Calvin, if you've only heard one thing about him, what's the one thing you've heard about him? Predestination. That's right. Predestination. The teaching of Calvin that is the one that everybody knows about or everybody talks about, Calvin taught that from the beginning of time, from the time God said, let there be light, every human being, forever, God has either destined for salvation or damnation. That every human being is destined for salvation or damnation. So before you were born, if you're a Calvinist, before you're born, God has already decided if you're going to be going to heaven or hell. That's what predestination is. And there's a handy dandy way to talk about talk about Calvin's with a word, at least the English way. Have anyone ever heard of tulip? Anybody ever heard tulip? Like the flower? Tulip? Okay. Tulip is the way that when you're trying to learn what did Calvin teach, it's this handy little not anagram. What's the acronym? It's the handy acronym for John Calvin's teaching. The T is for total depravity. Okay, T is for total depravity. It should be a song about this. T is for the total depravity. Calvin says everyone is born in sin. Okay? Everybody's born in sin. You're born a sinner. Every human being naturally sins. Sin is the state of humanity. There's total, depravity, as in depraved, as in evil, as in sinful. That every human being is sinful. Total depravity. U is for unconditional election. As in election, as in who has been elected, as in chosen by God for heaven or hell. So, the elect, the way that a Calvinist would refer to Christians, we are the elect. We have been elected by God to be saved. Okay, so unconditional election. Okay, L is for limited atonement. You've heard the word atonement. Atonement is what we talk about, what happened on the cross. Atonement, at-one-ment, the atonement is how we are made right with God, how our sins are forgiven, how we become acceptable in God's sight. Calvin said Jesus' atonement was limited to the elect. He died for the elect. Not for everybody. He died for the elect. I is for irresistible grace. If you're elect, you cannot resist God. If God has elected you to salvation, you're going to be saved, and you have no ability to resist that salvation. And finally, the P is perseverance. Perseverance of the saints. And your saints, and the saints, chosen, the elect, are all the same ones. In other words, if you're a Baptist, once saved, always saved. Is what that doctrine is. So, Calvin, when we talk about what did Calvin mean when he talked about predestination, this is what he's talking about. Now, you think, well, why where's that even? Why? Well, remember, Calvin, even though he's not a clergy person, he's a lawyer. He has a brilliant. All these guys have brilliant minds. I should be good on camera. He has a brilliant mind, and he says, okay, if God is truly all-powerful, then that means if he's all-powerful, then he has to decide who is saved and who isn't. There can be no free will. Because for people to be able to oppose God's will limits God's power, he would say. So he's saying, because if God truly is all powerful, then God makes the decision about everybody's salvation and who's saved and who's damned. And why are some chosen and elected and some not? Well, because God chose that way. I mean, there's no reason other than that was the choice of God. Now that is Calvinism. And there's a reason I'm not a Calvinist. The opposite viewpoint is by a fellow who lives a little bit later than Calvin, a fellow named Jacob Arminius. Okay? Jacob Arminius. And if this is Calvinism, then over here we have Arminianism. Okay? Jacob Arminius, in response to Calvin, says, no. He says, God made this choice, again, from the beginning of time, God made the choice to give human beings free will. Free will. Arminius says that God gave every human being the ability to either accept God's love or reject God's love. And that salvation is truly a choice. Still, we don't earn it, deserve it, buy it, but we either choose to receive that gift of salvation from God, or we choose to turn away from God and reject that gift and refuse that gift. But that it is our free will. And Arminius argues that teaching that God gives us free will does not diminish the idea of God's power. That God makes a choice, basically saying, if you force somebody to love you, is that really love? Or are you a puppet? Are you a character in a play that just does what the playwright has told you to do and say? I'm getting ahead of myself, but John Wesley is an Arminian. I'll talk about him later. John Wesley is an Arminian. Therefore, we Methodists, we're Arminians. And some people hear that like, we're from Armenia? No, not Armenians, Arminians, as in Jacob Arminius. We believe in free will. Now, sometimes when I do a confirmation class and I'm talking about the differences between different denominations, and I talk about how different denominations are either Calvinist or Arminian. And of course, Presbyterians are Calvinist. I mean, the followers of Calvin come to be known as the Presbyterians. Now, it's funny because people who grew up in the Presbyterian church sometimes go, well, I don't believe in that. I was like, well, if you're a Presbyterian, that's your whole thing. Presbyterians, Calvinism and predestination is one of the main points of being a Presbyterian. But if you go to a modern Presbyterian church, they're probably not going to emphasize that at all. I say to folks who grew up Southern Baptist, you guys are Calvinists too. And that's when I really get Southern Baptists like, what do you mean? Like, well, yeah, Southern Baptists are Calvinists. I said, why do you think there are churches called Free Will Baptist churches? I said, the whole reason there are Free Will Baptist churches is because those are Baptists who broke off from the Southern Baptist church because they believe in free will. They're like, well, I don't believe in that. I was like, well, okay, I agree, I believe you, but historically, Southern Baptists are Calvinists. Presbyterians are Calvinists. Lutherans are Calvinists. Methodists are not. Methodists are not. Nazarenes are not. Assembly of God is not. Pentecostal holiness is not, etc., etc. But this is one of the branches where Protestantism goes two different ways. Now, I'm trying to remember. Anybody here grew up Presbyterian? You knew all this, though, right?
I wasn't a real Presbyterian. I went to a Presbyterian church because that's where my Boy Scout group was.
Okay.
I knew about Calvin.
Well, does Calvin identify the elect when he proposes?
What do you mean identify?
Like, these people are.
Well, if you've accepted Christ and are a Christian, then you're part of the elect.
Yeah.
I mean,
If it's predetermined, then, well,
he would say, you may think...
Try to talk to other people and tell them about Christ because it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, it would, because some of those people are predestined to believe because of what you told them. It's all part of the script. It's all part of the plan.
It's a philosophy that doesn't matter. Because you can't prove it right or wrong.
Right. Right. And so what about somebody who falls away? Well, they were never a real Christian to begin with. I mean, yeah, you're right. You can't disprove it because it's basically, well, this person never would have believed if this person hadn't told them. Yeah, they were destined to tell them. I mean,
that's the once saved, always saved.
right. Right. And this gets back to the whole idea of destiny. I mean, destiny is not a uniquely Calvinist concept. Lots of other religions believe in some version of destiny. The idea that your future has already been written, that you are destined to do things, that you don't really make choices, that you're all just following a script that was written for you. Now, you don't know you're doing that. You think you have free will, but they would say, no. You're simply following the destiny that was laid out for you. How many movies have somebody doing something heroic and they say, it's your destiny, right? It's your destiny. You were destined to do this. In other words, this was all planned for you. How about folks who grew up Southern Baptists? Was this Calvinism taught? Yeah. My guess is that in most Presbyterian churches, most Southern Baptist churches, etc., this is probably almost never mentioned. But this is part of the heritage of those denominations. And Calvinists are also just sometimes referred to as Reformed. Sometimes they talk about the Reformed churches or the Calvinist churches. I went to a seminary that was multi-denominational, but the plurality of students, in other words, the group at my seminary had the biggest numbers was Presbyterians. Some of my professors were Reformed, were Presbyterian. So I got a pretty good dose of understanding of Calvinism. And you say, why would he come up with something like that? Well, again, he felt forced by the idea of God's sovereignty to come to this conclusion. But Arminius comes to a different conclusion. Well, anyway, because you can think about that, it kind of twists your brain up, I guess, in a way. But another reason why I'm a Methodist, because I truly do believe that God made the choice to give humans free will. And you might say that in some ways that's a big roll of the dice for God to really give us true free, because that gives us the freedom to reject him. The freedom not to accept his love, the freedom not to, every human being is free to either receive God's love or to reject it. So, anyway, historically, this whole Reformation thing is happening. Then we get to, again, one of the more, I think, interesting parts of the story. I think it's all interesting, but this is what happens in England, because this is really going to play into our Methodist background. What happens in England? Around this time, the King of England is a loyal Catholic named Henry VIII. Henry VIII. And he at first, when he hears about Luther, he's like, oh, that Luther guy, he's opposed to Luther because he's a good, loyal Catholic king, Henry VIII. And he's married to a loyal Catholic queen, Catherine of Aragon, who is a princess of Spain. And of course, like most royal weddings, at least in that day, royal weddings are political alliances. A king marries his daughter to another king's son to cement a political alliance, so those two countries are less likely to go to war if their children are married to each other. So princes and princesses and all these people intermarry mainly for political reasons. So Henry has married Catherine of Aragon, even though she's 7 or 8 years older than he is. He's like 15 when they get married, and she's like 23 or 4, something like that. What is, again, in this horribly paternalistic, chauvinistic world, what is the queen's main job? Have, not just a baby, have a son. Have a son. The queen's job one for the queen is to have a son, so that there will be a successor to the throne. So, Catherine's main job is to have a son. She has multiple miscarriages. She finally produces one child, a daughter, Mary. And then she stops having children altogether. So she has failed at her one job. Meanwhile, Henry has a wandering eye and has gotten very interested in a young woman at court named Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn. And he starts to have an affair with Anne Boleyn. He wants to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. But divorce is pretty tough in those days in the Catholic Church. Really, the only way you can get a divorce is if you can somehow prove adultery on the wife's part, or say that the marriage was never consummated. I mean, it's pretty tricky, pretty tough to get a divorce, even for a regular person. But if you're a king, it's all the harder, because to divorce Catherine is going to make who mad? Spain. Yeah, it's going to make Spain mad. So he appeals to the Pope to grant him a divorce or an annulment. Annulment would be saying that the marriage was never consummated, which is pretty tough when there's Mary standing there. Anyway, so the Pope, knowing that this would also anger Spain, the Pope says no. So Henry VIII, starts to say, maybe that Protestant stuff makes sense after all. Maybe all that Protestant stuff actually does make sense. All that stuff with Luther and Calvin and all those guys. So Henry VIII, because the Pope won't grant his divorce, makes a rather amazing decision. He has Parliament declare him as the head of the Church of England. And England is now its own autonomous church. The Church of England separates from the rest of the Catholic Church and becomes a separate church, the Church of England, aka the Anglican or Episcopal Church, the Church of England. And in the Anglican Church, the sovereign is also the head of the church. So even today, technically, King Charles III is the head of the Church of England, which is a little problematic. If you think about one of the quotes from King Charles, that he was interviewed, this is before he became king, when he was still Prince of Wales, talking about someday you will be the defender of the faith. That's one of the titles of the king or queen, the defender of the faith, as in defender of the Christian faith. And they asked Charles something like, how do you see yourself someday as being defender of the faith? And Charles said something like, well, I'd really rather see myself as defender of all faiths. Which sounds, of course, very politically correct, but if you're in the Church of England and the head of the Church of England has now said, well, I'm not really that committed to one faith, that's a little problematic. Now, of course, in reality, even though he is technically the head of the church, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the leading religious figure in the Anglican Church. And of course, if we were going to follow that train of thought, Henry marries Anne Boleyn, and that doesn't work out very well either. If you know the story, what happens to her? Yeah, she loses her head. Literally, she loses her head. She's beheaded, and he ends up having 4 more wives after that. Another one of whom loses her head, but he has 6 wives altogether, which is, of course, one of the things that makes him historically a very interesting person. At the PAC a few months ago, did anybody go to see Six? Six is a musical about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, but it's done as pop music. Yeah.
I mean, it may be based on history, but it's not teaching a lot.
No, it's not very historical. It's in name only, supposedly, about the 6 wives. But anyway, but lots of movies have been made about these people. But anyway, so Henry is now the head of the church, and the Church of England is now separate from the Catholic Church. And the Church of England goes through a lot of, what kind of church are they going to be? And the Church of England is kind of an interesting hybrid of Catholicism and Protestantism. It's kind of a middle ground, actually, between Catholicism and Protestantism. Matter of fact, a lot of people, if they go to an Anglican church today, an Episcopal church today, they call it Catholic Light. Because it has still kind of to some of us, if you go into a Catholic, into an Episcopal church or an Anglican church, it feels kind of Catholic. In terms of the order of service and the liturgy and everything else. It feels still kind of Catholic. It's kind of a Protestant church wrapped in a Catholic package, maybe. And it doesn't get settled right away because eventually Henry dies. He has one son is produced in all these marriages, but that son dies. So when Henry VIII dies, there's only 2 children to survive him. And the eldest is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary. And Mary has been raised Catholic. So when Mary, since there's no son to inherit the throne, it does go to Mary. And Mary is a good Catholic and orders that the whole Church of England go back and be Catholic again. So the church becomes... It's separate from the Catholic Church in 1534. In 1555, Mary becomes queen and says, we're going back to Catholic. And starts persecuting the new Protestant leaders. But she dies in 3 years. She dies very quickly. And she's succeeded by her sister, Elizabeth I, who sits on the throne for 40 years or something. I mean, not as long as Elizabeth II, but a long time, Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth then takes it back to Protestant again. And most scholars believe Elizabeth had no particular religious interest one way or the other, but she thought politically going back to Protestant was the best path.
She had to, otherwise she would be a bastard.
Yeah,
So she
right.
had to legitimize the church.
Right.
She had a legitimate claim.
Right. So, but I don't think she was a passionate Protestant. I think she was, politically for her, that was the only made sense. So, that's where the Church of England comes from. That's where the Anglican Episcopal Church comes from. And so, all of that to say, we flash forward in history. I mentioned Jacob Arminius. By the time in England we get to the early 1600s, the King of England is James, and James says we need a Bible, a good Bible in English. There'd been some other translations, but they weren't very good. And so James orders a new translation of the Bible in English to be produced. He gets up 24 scholars, it takes him 8 years, but finally in 1611 they publish a new English Bible called the King James Bible. And what's interesting is this Bible that was published in 1611 was still the most read Bible in the English world until maybe 50, 60 years ago. I mean, when the RSV was finally published, the Revised Standard Version was finally published. I mean, most churches still were using the King James up through the 1950s or 60s. And some churches today still only use the King James Bible. I know there are some churches that believe that somehow the King James Bible, the King James translation of the Bible, is more, I don't know, authentic, authoritative than any other translation. I've only done this a few times. I haven't done it recently, but occasionally these people who, with megaphones and, turn or you're going to die, or, turn to Jesus or you're all going to go to hell. These people who protest outside various things and scream at people. And sometimes I can't help myself, and I go up and say, guys, you're not helping. You're not doing anything here to draw people to Jesus. You're only pushing them away, da-da-da-da-da. And, I end up trying to talk to some of these people. And these particular people were screaming outside of a liquor store. And I don't drink liquor. I don't drink alcohol. But I said, guys, Jesus drank wine. Jesus made wine. No, he didn't. It's like, yeah, he did. He made big old gallons of it, in Cana. Nope, that was grape juice. I was like, actually, in the Greek it says winos, and that means that's wine in Greek. He's like, what, do you speak Greek? And I said, I understand Greek. They said, did you go to seminary? I was like, yes. He's like, well, that explains it. As in, well, that's why you're a heathen if you went to seminary, because you're so educated. And they said the King James Bible is more accurate than that Greek Bible. And I was like, what? And they tried to argue that the King James Bible was more authoritative than the original Greek or Hebrew manuscripts. And at that point, okay, I'm just wasting my time here. But because some people can't fix stupid, so but anyway, but there are still churches today that believe the King James is the only Bible you should use. I love the King James Bible, but that's not how we talk anymore. We don't say thee and thou and shalt and shan't and those kinds of things. And sometimes the King James Bible translation has things that really confuse people. Like, when the women are bringing the babies at wanting Jesus to touch them and bless them, and Jesus gets mad at the disciples and he says, suffer the children to come unto me. That's what it says in the King James. Suffer the children to come unto me. Like, suffer? Well, suffer 300 years ago meant permit, allow. That's why the women's voting movement was called the suffrage movement. But when we talk about suffering today, we don't usually mean it to mean allow or permit. We mean it somehow means like somebody's like in pain or something. Anyway, so words change. They've changed since 1611. Words don't mean the same thing they meant 400 years ago. Anyway, so I use lots of different translations. So Church of England, jump forward to the 1700s, and that's where, as I mentioned on Sunday, we get to the birth of John Wesley, 1703, born to a priest in the Church of England, a rector, Samuel Wesley, and his wife, Susanna Wesley. Susanna Wesley had 19 children. Only about half of them, I think 9 or 10 of them lived to past infancy. So she had about half of her children die in infancy. But still, 9 or 10 children is a lot to manage with a husband who's almost never home, who's in and out of debtor's prison. So Susanna had to manage a household and teach all of her children how to read and write and educate them, and et cetera, et cetera. Susanna Wesley was a remarkable woman and a better Bible teacher than her husband, even though he was the one who was the priest. The story I've told a few times, I don't think I told it in my sermon though, was Samuel Wesley, who was the rector or the priest of the church in Epworth, England, was gone a lot. He was working on a commentary that he was writing that ended up no one ever read unless they're studying the life of his son. But he would go to London to go to the library and do research, and he would be gone a lot. And he had kind of an assistant pastor there at Epworth that would preach when he would be gone for months at a time, or in debtor's prison for months at a time. You could tell how popular a pastor he was because apparently the members of his church tried to burn his house down at one point because the parsonage caught on fire, and they think somebody set it. And little John, when he was 5 years old, was on the second story and had to be rescued and barely made it out alive, which is one reason they thought God has something special for little John here. Anyway, when Samuel would be away and his associate was preaching, his associate was not a good preacher, and his sermon every week was about money, paying your debts, and wasn't about anything people wanted to hear. So people stopped coming to church altogether in Epworth. Meanwhile, Susanna Wesley, because she wanted her children to have a religious education, on Sunday afternoons would sit her children down in the kitchen and teach them Bible lessons. And some people heard about this and went, "Hey, can I come listen to you teach the Bible lessons?" And Susanna let them come. And then, there were dozens, and then there was 100 people there outside the windows, and then there was a couple of 100 people listening to Susanna Wesley teach her children the Bible on Sunday afternoons, while the pews were empty on Sunday morning with the associate pastor. So this, of course, made the associate pastor very upset and mad and embarrassed and humiliated. So he writes a letter to Samuel Wesley up in England, or London, "Sir, what your wife is doing is very improper," and blah, 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 blah. And so Samuel writes a letter back to Susanna, something like, "My dear, this is highly improper and embarrassing and blah, 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 and you need to not do that." And then Susanna writes back to Samuel something like, "My dear, if you command me to stop, I shall, but then the people's souls will be on your conscience." And he never commanded her to stop. So Susanna is the star of this family and has the most impact on the children and on John and his brother Charles especially. And as I said, John goes to Oxford, becomes a priest, goes to Georgia to try to convert the Indians, the Native Americans, and fails. Has a sort of a romance with a woman in the colony there, Sophie Hopke, but he can't decide if marriage is for him or not, so he kind of just is, she never knows where does he stand, so she finally says he's never going to propose. So she goes off and gets proposed to another man, gets engaged to another man. This makes John Wesley upset, and they stop coming to church, and when they do come, one day he won't serve them communion because he says they're out of fellowship with the church because he won't serve them communion. So the new fiancé sues John Wesley, and Wesley has to flee back to England to avoid the lawsuit. So Wesley gets back to England as he's humiliated, he's discouraged, he's disgraced, he's depressed. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do. He questions his calling. He questions even his faith. He questions everything until he goes, I think I said so, he goes to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street in London. They're reading Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. So this is where this history connects. They're reading Martin Luther's commentary. Of course, Martin Luther is the one who continually says, look what Paul says, we're saved by faith. We're saved by the grace of God, not by our works. And that's when Wesley has this aha moment that he'd been preaching God loves the world, but now God loves John Wesley. It became personal for him in a way that I guess it had never been personal for him before. And Wesley has this, he says his heart is strangely warmed, And it changes him, and it makes him a different kind of priest, a different kind of pastor. And that's when he starts having this enthusiastic preaching for people to convert, preaching for salvation, you know. And in the Church of England, when I talk about this in confirmation, the kids are always like, what? He's accused of being an enthusiast, which was a bad thing, to be accused of being an enthusiast. That meant for them somebody who was not, you know, a clergyman is supposed to be very proper and calm and scholarly and not get too wound up or excited, you know. And Wesley, they said, was a little too excited, a little too wound up, a little too animated. He wasn't being, you know, a proper British gentleman in the pulpit. And so he's kind of excluded. He doesn't have his own church, and he as a guest preacher, he does no invitations. He's barred from churches. He has a friend from college, from Oxford, and when he had been at Oxford, he and his brother Charles and 2 or 3 other men had been in this sort of Bible study group, but it was a very hardcore Bible study group. They got up and prayed and studied the Bible every morning at 4 a.m. They visited prisons. Wesley himself had a journal, a daily to-do list of every 15 minutes. 9 o'clock, 9:15, 9:30, 9:45, 10 o'clock, 10:50, etc. The entire day, and he'd written in what he was supposed to be doing at every 15-minute interval. And he had this very structured life. And so the other Oxford students, this is in the 1700s, but even back then, college students are not that serious about a lot of things. The other college students thought they were crazy. So they called them Bible moths. They called them the Holy Club. They called them the Methodists. The Methodists. So the term was meant to be an insult because they were so methodical about their life. But that's where the word comes from. It's kind of like the word Yankee, you know. It was meant as an insult, and it became something that the Americans adopted. But anyway, after his Aldersgate Street experience, that's when his friend from college, a guy named George Whitefield, who was a Calvinist, by the way, his friend George Whitefield says there are people hungry for the gospel that will never walk into a church because they're not welcome. They don't have the right clothes. They don't smell good. And he encourages Wesley to start preaching to people in the streets, in the fields. And that's what Wesley does. He starts preaching in the streets and in the fields. But the difference between George Whitefield, who was doing this also, and John Wesley, Whitefield would go and he'd get a crowd and he'd preach, and he apparently was a good preacher, and people would get kind of motivated and even come up and cry and say they were going to follow Jesus. And then Whitefield would go to the next town and do the same, and the people that he left behind, after a few weeks, some of that excitement kind of started to wear off. Kind of like sometimes I always worry, sometimes when people go on a retreat or a Christian camp or something like that, and the last night of camp, some of the kids get real worked up, and then if they don't have a follow-up and they don't keep going to church, some of that excitement from the last night of camp starts to fade a little bit. Wesley would go and preach, and then he would say, come back tonight. And they'd come back tonight, and he would organize them into these small groups, these Bible study groups, and these little Methodist societies. And that's why when we're studying all this, there is no movement that was named after George Whitefield, but Wesley's movement sticks because it wasn't just get them excited one time and move on. It was get them to start meeting weekly. And Wesley saw this also as a way to revitalize the Church of England. He wasn't trying to start a new thing. I mean, he wasn't trying to break away. He was just trying to revitalize what he saw as a dead church. But these Methodist societies get bigger and more, and he recruits other priests and lay people to do this effort all across England. And then they say, what about the American colonies? they send preachers to America, to the colonies. The one that you would have heard of was Francis Asbury. And then there's this thing called the American Revolution in the 1770s. And the Church of England kind of falls out of popularity in America during the American Revolution. And that's why the Methodist movement in America becomes the Methodist Church. So the Methodist Church is born in America. Eventually, the Methodists in England break away from the Church of England too, but it's many years after the church in America is started. And that's where the Methodist movement turns into the Methodist Church, which, just to bring it up to the actual name of the church is the Methodist Episcopal Church that is formed in 1784 in Baltimore, Maryland on Christmas Day. Methodist Episcopal Church, because the word Episcopal just means a church with bishops, because episkopos in Greek means bishop. So the Methodist Episcopal Church is a church that has bishops. Francis Asbury is the first bishop of the Methodist Church in America. So the Methodist Church is formed in 1784. Then in 1784. Then in 1844, so 60 years later, there's a split between the northern churches and the southern churches because slavery. And the question is, can Methodist pastors own slaves? And the pastors in the north say, of course not. Slavery is horrible. Slavery is awful. Slavery is inhumane. It goes against everything we teach about Christianity and Jesus. I mean, slavery is horrible. And the northern pastors say, of course a pastor can't have slaves. And many of the bishops and pastors in the south said, well, Paul does say slaves obey your masters. And, anyway, in 1844 at General Conference, the church divides into two halves, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And those two branches stay separate for almost 100 years. They don't come back and have a reunification until 1939. So from 1844 until 1939, there are those two branches. And of course, there are multiple other branches that break off from the Methodist Church in the 1800s and 1900s. Some of them you had heard of, the Nazarenes, the Salvation Army, the Pentecostal Holiness, the Assembly of God, the Free Methodist, which is not about free will. Free Methodist was about the practice of buying your pew. There used to be, if a family would buy their pew, and that was a way the church paid for things, and that was your pew. It had your name on it, and only you could sit in that pew. And the Free Methodists said, that was as the Methodist Church got more established, some of the churches started to establish this practice of buying a pew, a family pew that only that family could sit in. And there was a group that said, all the pews should be free. So that's where the Free Methodist Church came from. That's where the name came from. There were some other doctrinal differences as well. But there's multiple denominations and churches that either use the word Methodist or the word Wesley in their name. As you know, there's currently lots of discussion about that, not just at our church, but at every United Methodist Church about the future and what is the best way to proceed in terms of denominations. But that's from Martin Luther to John Wesley. That's for me one of the most interesting parts of Christian history, and it gets us to more or less where we are today. There's I jumped over. Lots and lots of things I jumped over. Just as I said, Luther was not a perfect person. John Wesley was not a perfect person either. unfortunate romance with Sophie Hopke in Georgia, Wesley finally did marry later in life a widow, a very unhappy marriage, because he was never home. I mean, he was always on horseback going from town to town preaching. He was literally never home. And she got tired of sitting there by herself. And she finally left him. I mean, hard to blame her. He wasn't abusive, but he just was never there. So Wesley never had children. His brother Charles was happily married and had children, and etc. But John Wesley was not happy in love in terms of romance. He was rather a stern person, you can tell, at least most of the time. The thing I always find curious about John Wesley, if you're looking at negatives in his life, he founded a school called Kingswood School for poor children, which is a wonderful thing. Because he worked against poverty and worked for poor children. He worked against the prison conditions. He worked tirelessly to try to get Great Britain to outlaw the slave trade. Worked with a young man named William Wilberforce, who was involved in the Parliament in abolishing the slave trade. Wesley did a lot of good stuff, and he established this school. But he had very strict rules for the students at the school. The students were expected to get up at 5 a.m. and pray for an hour. Very, very strict rules for the children. And he didn't believe in play. He thought they needed to exercise, so they should march about the yard. But he didn't believe in anything frivolous. Anything that he considered to be frivolous or a waste of time, something that wasn't absolutely necessary, he had little time for anything that we might call fun. So I don't think he'd be the kind of guy you'd want to maybe vacation with. Or I don't think John Wesley would be the guy that you'd want to probably have just to be a buddy. But as I say, no matter which hero you look to in history or in real life, in present day, nobody's perfect. Martin Luther wasn't perfect. John Wesley wasn't perfect. None of us are perfect. But the thing that both Luther and Wesley, I think, had in common was this sort of iron will. Wesley rode 250,000 miles on horseback preaching. He preached an average of 3 times every day. He lived to be about 90 years old, too. That's getting up every morning at 4 o'clock to pray. He was a tough guy. Well, time for 1 or 2 questions or comments if you had any about any of that. Yes, ma'am.
Question, back to predestination. Was there anything biblical about this, or was this just interpretation?
There are some passages that you can, I wish I could call up the passage right now, but there's a couple that talk about those whom God chose. There's a couple of places in the New Testament that mention God choosing people. And so somebody who is a Calvinist can point to 2 or 3 passages that you can see. I think they can be read different ways. But there are a couple of passages that a Calvinist can point to that seems to talk about God choosing us. So, yeah, there are some passages that a Calvinist could point to.
Chosen people.
Yeah. The idea of God's sovereignty. If God is, a Calvinist would say, if God is sovereign, then there's no room for free will. If God truly if he's got the whole world in his hands, if he's in control of everything, that leaves no room for freedom, they would say.
Does that come under the many are called, but few are chosen?
Yeah, they could probably interpret that passage that way too. Yeah. The idea that when God chooses Abraham, it says, well, out of all the men on earth, why does he choose Abraham? Why? We would later say that Abraham is a man of faith. But there are elements in the Old Testament especially where when God chooses somebody, we say, well, why did he choose this guy and not that guy? And there's no explanation given other than God made that choice. So, yeah, I mean, a Calvinist can point to passages, but so can an Arminian. I mean, about our freedom to choose. I mean, and I am familiar, I can't pull up the reference at the moment, but there's passages that can be interpreted as a God choosing, and there's other passages that seem to talk more of our free choice and our choosing to either follow or not follow. But yeah, they're not meant. See, a Calvinist at least has some scripture to stand on, as opposed to something like purgatory. I know of no passage of scripture that you can use to back up the idea of purgatory. I mean, it's just not there. So, all right, well, got 5 minutes to spare. Let me pray. Lord, we're grateful for your church, full of just fallible, sinful folks like us. We're so grateful for men and women like Martin Luther and Susanna Wesley and John Wesley and others that we look back to and see how they had such an impact on your church and had a heart for you and a desire for people to come to you and know you and learn about you. And Lord, we're thankful that we continue to be in that same stream of history, that we want to be a part of the people who hear your calling and then respond, here I am, Lord, and then do what you call us to do. Love as you have loved us and treat people the way that you would have us treat them. Love people the way that you love. So be with your church, our local church, our congregation, and all the churches, Lord, the Methodist churches that are all now struggling and discerning and really in having tough discussions and conversations, and other denominations, other churches, any place where your name is lifted up, where Jesus is lifted up, we lift them up to you now and I see you bless them.